Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on this day 2 of the 2021 Paris Peace Forum. My name is Blaine Curcio, and I'm joining you live from Paris. Today, I'm going to moderate a panel discussing experiences in establishing a space commercialization dialogue between the United States and China. And I'll be joined by two esteemed colleagues, Jose Ocasio-Christian of the Caelus Foundation and Ian Christensen of the Secure World Foundation. The format of today's discussion is going to involve 3 short introductions from myself and my 2 colleagues, followed by a video from our Chinese counterparts at the Chinese Society of Astronautics, and then about 45 minutes of discussion and question and answers about our experiences in establishing this dialogue. So to give a very short introduction of myself before turning it over to my 2 colleagues, as I mentioned, my name is Blaine Curcio, and I have been working since 2019 with the Caelus Foundation, Secure World Foundation, and our partners at the Chinese Society of Astronautics in holding an ongoing series of bilateral workshops to share perspectives on space commercialization. Our session today is going to discuss these experiences, which have involved informal and unofficial dialogues between ourselves and Chinese counterparts, oftentimes joined by others from the US, China, or elsewhere. Additionally, we're going to discuss the outcomes from the most recent one of these dialogues, which occurred just yesterday on the sidelines of the Paris Peace Forum, titled The Small Group Dialogue on Space Traffic Management and Space Safety. My name is Blaine Curcio. I'm the CEO and founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, based in Hong Kong. As I mentioned, I'm also a board member at the Caelus Foundation and have been working with Caelus and Secure World over the last several years on space commercialization topics. I also work regularly with a Euroconsult, a Paris-based consulting firm, on satellite and space-related consulting and market research projects. On behalf of all of our panelists and organizations, I would like to again thank you for joining us today at the Paris Peace Forum, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing any questions or discussion points about space commercialization dialogues between China and the United States. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jose Ocasio-Christian from the Caelus Foundation, who will give an introduction of himself and his organization. Jose?
Thank you, Blaine, and good morning, everybody from McLean, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. I want to first thank the Paris Peace Forum for giving us this opportunity to present, and I will first describe the Caelus Foundation. Caelus Foundation is a nonprofit, non-government organization, 501c3, and it's a volunteer organization. And in this role, I am the chairman of the board for the foundation, and I'm here on a volunteer basis. Our mission is to bring space back down to Earth. And what we mean by that is ensuring that leaders that are either not in space, that are in the space industry, from the highest levels to the lowest individual on the streets, have a clear understanding of the opportunities, the challenges, and the issues associated with space commercialization. We run a variety of programs, track 2 diplomatic discussions, in this case with China, with our partners at Secure World Foundation and the Chinese Society of Astronautics, is obviously a clear important one. As for myself, I've been operating as the CEO of 2 organizations as a strategic consultant. One is the Caelus Partners, in which we provide strategic consulting around the world on economic development integration of space and space technology and budgets with governments. The second area is we build portfolios for investment, as well as through the Community Space LLC, we help build those funds and the capital assets to be able to execute those investments. And that is for any investor of any type or government. And then lastly, we work in capital markets. We're most well known for developing one of our members developing the index that set up the UFO space ETF that trades in NASDAQ, and it trades in the London Stock Exchange with $120 million worth of assets. And the significance of that is it helps analysts around the world understand that a space company can be invested in outside of the aerospace and defense sector. And prior to that, and qualifies me for this work, is my 22 years of service in the U.S. Army as a strategist and as an infantry officer, where some of my missions throughout the time was track 2 diplomatic discussions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jose, for that introduction, and always happy to hear your background. And Ian, if you could give a short introduction, and then I believe we will have a video immediately after from our Chinese counterparts.
Yes, thank you, Blaine, and good morning. Good morning from Denver, Colorado, and good afternoon to all of you in Paris and whatever time zone we are in. It's an honor to be here today at the Paris Peace Forum. My name is Ian Christensen, and I am Director of Private Sector Programs for the Secure World Foundation. Secure World Foundation is a US-based private operating foundation dedicated to the secure and sustainable use of space for the benefit of Earth and all its peoples. SWF engages with stakeholder communities to support steps that strengthen global space sustainability. The United States and China are two of the most advanced and capable countries across multiple aspects of space activities, including the commercialization of space. There are geopolitical, economic, and sovereign differences in the ways that the United States and China approach the commercialization of the space domain, just as there are in most other aspects of what is overall a competitive relationship. Yet, even in the midst of this competitive context, we see that engagement is possible in some areas, as recent announcements around climate change response demonstrate. In the space domain, both countries are ambitiously seeking to position their space programs as drivers of economic growth and diplomatic leverage. As the global commercial space sector continues to rapidly develop, the decisions that these two countries make, both together and separately, will have significant implications for the rest of the global space community and for the stability of the space domain. Since 2019, Secure World Foundation and Caelus Foundation have worked with the Chinese Society of Astronautics to establish a regular dialogue between U.S. and Chinese commercial space stakeholders on trends and activities in space commercialization. In today's session, as Blaine and Jose have already mentioned, we will share and discuss our experience on this dialogue program, including an informal small group dialogue on space traffic management and space safety, which was held yesterday between American and Chinese commercial space stakeholders here on the margins of the forum. Although this specific session was not directly part of our joint dialogue with the CSA, it did share that same spirit of enhancing mutual understanding. However, before we get into that discussion, I'm pleased to introduce pre-recorded video remarks from my colleague at the Chinese Society of Astronautics, Dr. Zhang Yao, who will introduce our dialogue program. Thank you.
Dear delegates, my name is Zhang Yao. I'm from Chinese Society of Astronautics. I'm in charge of international business. I'm honored and pleased to share my views with you at the session of experience with establishing a space commercialization dialogue between the US and China at the 2021 Paris Peace Forum. First of all, please allow me briefly introduce to you CSA. CSA was founded in 1979. It is a non-government and non-profit organization composed of China's space professionals. CSA has 42 technical committees, 179 institutional members, and more than 30,000 individual members. Our purpose is to promote the innovation and development of space, science and technology, popularize space knowledge, inherit and spread the space spirit, and foster space talents. CSA is committed to conducting friendly cooperation with partners from all over the world and building a high-end academic exchange platform for space people home and abroad. As NGOs, CSA, the Caelus Foundation, the Secure World Foundation, all believe that the dialogue and cooperation between China and the US, the two major space countries in the world, are of great and far-reaching significance to promoting the global peaceful use of outer space. In view of this, since 2019, the three organizations have jointly held a series of Sino-US commercial space dialogue to explore how commercial space can serve people's life. So far, 4 editions have been held. More than 400 officials, leaders, experts, and scholars from government departments, state-owned enterprises, commercial companies, research institutions, and colleges and universities of the two countries shared their insights on the platform of the dialogue. The discussion topics covered policies, such as system innovation of commercial space and legal regulation of suborbital space travel, technology such as Earth-Moon space exploration and development, commercial space integration solutions, economy such as space tourism demand and market analysis, status and development of satellite Internet of Things, culture such as the gap between the US understanding and China's commercial space status, and international cooperation based on responsible space behavior. The content fully reflects the three important stages of commercial launch, industrial development, and popular service in the development of commercial space, as well as the characteristics of commercial space of the two countries. The topics of the Sino-US Commercial Space Series Dialogue are re-innovated, and the content is constantly enriched, and the level is improved year by year, and the influence is gradually enhanced. It has become a unique platform for China and America space people to talk about commercial space. Our series of dialogues has the following three characteristics. First, the dialogue is sincere. Every country in the world has its own advantages and disadvantages in space field. The space people of China and the United States have conducted equal dialogue, exchanges, and mutual learning in multiple fields and angles, rediscovered, reconsidered, and re-innovated the problems of the development of commercial space so as to put more wisdom into the development of commercial space in the two countries, regions, and even the world. Second, the dialogue is long-term. The space societies of the two countries have played a unique role in establishing a long-term dialogue mechanism between China and the US in the field of civil and commercial space through extensive and continuous academic exchanges, enhancing mutual trust between the two countries in the field of space and providing a channel for deepening understanding between the two countries. Finally, the dialogue is pragmatic. The COVID-19 pandemic and the instability and uncertainty of the international situation have brought us great challenges. In-depth exchanges among the non-governmental organizations and focusing on topics of practical significance will build a bridge for people of all countries to deepen understanding, enhance friendship, and strengthen cooperation. As the old Chinese saying goes, as a journey of thousands of miles may not be achieved through accumulation of each single step, just as the enormous ocean may not be formed through gathering every brook or stream. For dialogue, the participation is important and the persistence is valuable. In the future, the three organizations will spare no efforts to promote the continuation of the dialogue. We will invite people interested in commercial space from all countries to join the dialogue. We believe that the dialogue will eventually have a far-reaching impact and bring enlightenment to our common response to today's global dialogues. Thank you.
Well, and a remote thank you very much to Dr. Zhang Yao. And while it is very much an honor to be here, I'm thrilled this afternoon. If there was one thing that I could change, it would be for us to be joined by our esteemed Chinese counterparts at the CSA, because they have been and continue to be truly excellent counterparts in terms of trying to continue this dialogue. So just a short reminder to anyone viewing, there is room for Q&A, so if you have any questions, do feel free to throw those into the Q&A. And to get things started, I will hand it over to Ian Christensen to give us a little bit of background on what our commercial space dialogues have entailed thus far, and what have we been doing over these past 3 years with our Chinese counterparts. So Ian, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Blaine, and I echo your appreciation to Dr. Zhang and the CSA colleagues. It has been a very pleasant and engaging journey, as Dr. Zhang mentioned, over the last 3 years. And so I do wish that they could be with us in person today as well. So as was mentioned in the video, we have held 4 dialogues to date, the most recent as of October 16th, 2021, so just about a month ago, or less than a month ago. Also at Caelus and Secure World Foundation during this process, we've produced some novel research looking at the underlying challenges related to US-China commercial space dialogue as they pertain to perceptions that people in the ecosystem have. So in the next few minutes, I want to take us through the history of this USChina Space Commercialization Dialogue to date, and talk about some of our objectives, some of the topics that we've covered, and how this has developed over the last 3 years. And then once we finish that, Jose and I will talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned through this process. So this program has 3 central objectives. The first is to improve the knowledge and information base space stakeholders in each country have regarding the activities of the other related to space commercialization. By establishing better flows of information, this program hopes to increase nuance and reduce hyperbole in the information used in business and policy strategy. Second, our objective is to reduce potential misunderstandings and misperceptions that might act to increase tension. Obviously, the relationship between the US-China exists in the context of geopolitical challenge. Space has its own role to play in that. Dialogue, it can help promote transparency, objectives, and intent, while respecting the sovereign requirements and interests of each state, and thus support and maintain long-term stability. Third objective is to identify areas of mutual interest. Even in the midst of this overall competitive relationship, the US and China do face shared challenges as they seek to develop space industry capabilities and commercialize those capabilities. This program seeks to identify, where possible, these areas of shared challenges and begin to discuss them. So our first dialogue was held in April 2019. It was held in Changsha, China, as part of the annual China Space Conference. This was an in-person discussion. Chinese speakers there included representatives from the China National Space Administration and several major aerospace state-owned enterprises. US speakers on our delegation included academics and non-governmental organizations. This discussion was a very high-level introductory discussion of simply the trends and developments in the space industry in both countries. We then shifted into 2020, where, of course, the global situation changed significantly with the pandemic, which, of course, caused us to adapt to shift our meetings from in-person to online and hybrid format. The second workshop in this dialogue series was held in September of 2020. Presenters at this session included the CEO of a U.S. commercial space company, a leading U.S. researcher who described a recent report that she'd published assessing China's emerging commercial space sector and defining that sector, and a former career U.S. diplomat. Chinese presenters included both state-owned and commercial companies involved in space launch and satellite constellation activities. Third workshop was held in April of 2021. Topics here included viewpoints on the space economy, trends in space tourism and cislunar development, and discussion of satellite constellations for broadband and Internet of Things applications. We also discussed themes of policy and regulatory best practice and the value and role of market competition. Presenters included representatives of commercial spaceflight companies in both the US and China. In February of 2021, SWF, my organization, and Caelus Foundation released a research report describing US perceptions of Chinese commercial space activities in comparison to how those space activities are described in the literature. This research was based on a set of interviews across the U.S. commercial space ecosystem and gave us a little bit more perspective and background to bring into our dialogue sessions. Fourth workshop was held in October of 2021 with a focus on commercial human spaceflight. Presenters included a U.S. human spaceflight company, a U.S. nonprofit focused on expanding access to human spaceflight, and Chinese commercial launch and satellite companies, as well as legal and industry analysts. Since April 2020, each of these workshops has featured an increasing amount of interaction and discussion. We've increasingly moved from keynote presentations to back and forth dialogue, interactive over the virtual connection. Topics discussed, and this is just an illustrative example, not the complete list. Topics discussed during this dialogue include insights into viewpoints on the definition of commercial space in China, how those compare, the role of terminology in describing how commercial space development will occur, viewpoints on the expansion of consumer use of space and how that relates to industrial base development, and viewpoints on the need for regulation of commercial space and human spaceflight to provide industry confidence while balancing risk tolerance and safety with innovation. So that's a really high-level overview of the work that we've done in the last 3 years. And I think at this point, Blaine, we can get into some of the more interesting discussion of what we've learned.
Well, Ian, that is a much appreciated and very well delivered overview, given that it is 5:22 a.m. where you are. So I really do appreciate that. And so, yeah, definitely we can dig into some of these more specific points. And certainly, I would echo your point that we've really evolved from keynote speeches of one side speaking to the other and vice versa, to most recently yesterday during our informal discussion, a lot more back and forth and a lot more just interaction. So that being said, Jose, do you want to take over and kind of discuss a little bit maybe some of the top themes that you've noticed or some of the topics that you think are most relevant?
I agree. I thank you, Blaine, and great overview, Ian. I want to first start with a little bit of structure for those to give the audience a level of appreciation of the level of difficulty. As everyone knows, U.S. and China relations have always been challenged, especially the last 3 years, compile current geopolitical environment on economics, the coronavirus, and other challenges to sustain a informal and unofficial dialogue through appropriate means, regulations, and appropriate protocols shows the level of complexity that this is. I just don't want that to be lost because people like Yang Sao have literally worked on her end, just like as we have, to sustain this dialogue as appropriate as possible. And the title of our story here is Track 2 Diplomatic Discussions. So that first part is significant. The second thing I want to add is the coordination effort. For those who are either participating to bring the speakers in, what's the difference? The difference is a journey. So for folks like ourselves who volunteer for this, trying to get a gauge of the geopolitical situation, then further neck down to the economic or capital market situation or that area to be able to determine what is appropriate at what time. That has taken skill and has taken time to negotiate, to work with other folks. So I think for those who want to do this, the journey matters. It is just as valuable as the notes you take in these meetings, and therefore why the folks who do this, it's a very serious event and it's a very serious commitment to perform something like this. The other area I want to highlight is the approaches over the last 2 years. It becomes evident how commercialization is seen by China in the terminology and how commercialization is seen by the U.S. in its terminology. And in that terminology alone, I'll turn it over to Ian to talk a little bit about that because, of course, we've had other folks in our foundation that's worked this throughout the years. But that terminology alone can lead to a perception in these informal dialogues. So very, very key to understand what those words are. When you use words like new space, it can be very confusing. When you're using what is civil space, what is commercial space, I can tell you many experiences and where we have had to sort through those definitions, and those things take weeks or months. But again, the journey is what matters when you're trying to structure this. Ended conversation is the healthy result as of it. I'll turn it over to you. I got a couple more, but I want to turn it over to you, Ian, for some other areas that you saw.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. I mean, and the point you mentioned about terminology, I think is an important one to kind of spend a further minute on, right? So obviously, when we're talking about an exchange between U.S. And Chinese stakeholders, communication is difficult to begin with. You have language barriers, you have cultural differences, you have the context of this very overall challenging relationship. And so you bring all of these dimensions in to start. And then we're talking about the space industry and the space sector, where technical terms are highly prevalent, jargon is highly prevalent, acronyms are highly prevalent, and we use terms like new space or old space or commercial space. And even within a single stakeholder group, take a set of US actors, that set of actors may not have the same definitions, the same understanding, or the same assumptions behind their use of those terms. So terms like new space, old space, they have identity assumptions behind them, but those identity assumptions are not commonly held or commonly understood. And then you try to take that in a cross-cultural context, an international context, and they become even more vague than that. Jose, I see you have
it's funny.
Reaction hot pursuit. So, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what's funny about that? Turning to Blaine, who's a practitioner in this, you can share also more about internally how China sees itself. I think it's valuable to tell our audience in terms of commercial space, just in general, what China sees and how that's reflected in some of these meetings. I think that'd be invaluable for the group.
Sure. So I think the first thing I would definitely echo is this idea that the phrase commercial space is not particularly well defined, both in the U.S. and in China. And I think part of this is because most of space remains, at the end of the day, at least partially government run, or at least, government supported. And so the idea of commercial space, again, it's not a particularly clear definition. That being said, in China, the idea of commercial space really has only come about since about 2014. Prior to that, everything within the Chinese space sector was basically controlled by state-owned enterprises. And even over these past 7 years, we've seen a very large number of commercial companies coming into the market in China. But this phrase commercial, again, I have a colleague in China who talks about how there are 4 different flavors of commercial companies, going from a spin-off from a state-owned enterprise that still has a very deep relationship to that state-owned enterprise, but is technically a commercial company. So this would be typically like a leading Chinese commercial launch company called X-Space, which is essentially a spin-off of the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have basically like purely commercial companies that have IPO'd and that are receiving most of their funding from the market, and that don't necessarily have these relationships with state-owned enterprises. And again, in the Chinese context, both of these types of companies would be considered commercial. So it's not entirely clear what this phrase encapsulates when looking at China. Now, to Jose's other point about sort of how does China view, I guess, commercial space, and how do they view themselves in, say, the global commercial space market, I think what we've seen in China over these past 5 to 10 years has been an increasing realization or increasing change in philosophy that to achieve certain types of innovation, to maintain pace with certain companies in the West, it may be advisable, or it may be advantageous to open up certain parts of the space sector for commercial companies. Now, this is being done in a deliberate way, to the extent that most of the activity in the Chinese space sector is still state-owned enterprises. But we've seen, again, more than 100 commercial companies coming out of the woodwork in China over these past 7 years in sectors such as launch vehicles or Earth observation satellites or communication satellites. So yeah, certainly we've seen this evolution of commercial space in China, and we've seen this vast growth in the commercial space sector. So yeah, that would be kind of the takeaway from my end. Jose, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, Blaine, I think you want to add in some in here, so go ahead, brother.
Yeah, so this is Ian, I'm not Jose, but I'm going to jump in here. So Blaine, I think what you're talking about actually picks up on or relates to one of the insights that we've picked up through this dialogue, right? Is in that why do stakeholders, commercial space stakeholders from the US or China, however you define commercial space, why do they want to participate in a discussion like this, right? What is the reason that stakeholders would want to participate in a dialogue? What do they see out of it, and how does this contribute to that? So you talked about China opening up the space industry to more private development and what that means and what that looks like, right? And how Chinese companies are looking to develop strategy and build out a business, right? As we talk to the stakeholders that have participated in this process with us, we've kind of seen, I think, that both U.S. and Chinese commercial space stakeholders want to learn more about how the sector is organized in the other country in order to make better informed strategic decisions, right? And that seems pretty obvious to say, right? Why else would you participate in something like this? But there's more to it. U.S., through the research that we did, and I want to give a shout out to my colleague Rob Ronci, who's not with us today, but who was a key co-author on the perceptions research we did. One of the key findings we found was that U.S. stakeholders view Chinese firms as inevitable future competitors. They largely welcome competition, but U.S. firms want that to be under fair and defined rules, and therefore may simply want to better understand how the Chinese commercial space sector operates. On the other side, if you flip the coin around, Chinese space stakeholders, as far as we can tell from this dialogue, look to learn from U.S. companies as an example of best practices in terms of business acumen and strategic strategic approach, and they also look to the U.S. experience in regulation. So, as the space sectors, the commercial space sectors, the industry sectors in both countries mature, this is the sort of learning, dialogue, and better understanding that we hope this process can build. I wanted to
Absolutely
add that in there.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, this is one of the things that was evident in yesterday's Space Traffic Management Track 2 discussion, which is to say the U.S., for better or worse, is quite a bit further along in terms of space traffic management as an industry, simply because we've had a lot more stuff in orbit for a rather longer period of time. And one of the takeaways from yesterday's talk is that the Chinese participants were clearly happy to learn some of the best practices, happy to understand how the industry has evolved in the U.S., because the space traffic management topic, while still a bit nascent in China, is becoming a bigger and bigger topic. So certainly, to Ian's point, there's really interesting motivations for both sides to be taking part in these discussions, and I think that Ian really hit the nail on the head with the two descriptions that he provided.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. And as we go transition into yesterday's discussion, if you're a government official on either U.S. and China for any track 2 diplomatic discussion, the best opportunity is being able to see without having to put an opinion in, without having to say anything, and participate in being able to listen to understand what messages are coming across and how do you interpret that. And that is the purpose of why we do this, to provide options. We know that there are sovereign state positions in which each country, either commercially, sovereign security, diplomatic, and so forth, and technology, you have to follow for each country. However, having those informal and unofficial discussions give the opportunity to at least dismiss some of those perceptions you may have and allow for opportunity. So whenever you are preparing something like this, it is not about who comes in to talk. It is not about, what you're going to try to influence. It is simply providing an option for being able to listen what the other side is trying to say. So there's no misnomer about us versus them. It is simply we're there. People, governments, and other officials and industry are welcome from each side, are welcome to listen in, primarily listening, not a lot of commenting, because we want to leave it to those subject matter experts to engage one another so we can learn from that interaction. But Blaine, for the sake of time and our questions, I think we should go a little bit into yesterday's discussion.
Absolutely, and just a reminder to any viewers and listeners that we do have Q&A, so do feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. But yeah, so going into yesterday's session, again, we had a discussion on space traffic management, and this is an increasingly important topic not only in the space sector, but also here at the Paris Peace Forum. We have a session this afternoon on a net zero space initiative that aims to, among other things, limit, or I suppose improve the ability to manage traffic in space, as it were. And so again, yesterday we had a discussion with several U.S. commercial space companies and several Chinese commercial space companies on this very topic. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a bigger topic in the U.S. up to now, because we have, constellations like Starlink and OneWeb and others that are they're deploying very quickly. But in China, we've seen a lot more interest in this space traffic management topic. So I guess that being said, Jose or Ian, did either of you have any specific takeaways on yesterday's talk that you think are particularly relevant to, I see your hand raised, Jose, so you can.
Yeah, and I'll take it away here, and Ian, for the sake of time, we'll share a couple because we want to give time to our audience to ask questions if they have. So I'll highlight a couple. I cannot go over all of them. We took 2.5 hours worth of notes, so we'll go through it. Blaine talked about one of the big key points. The first one, that being the space traffic management and where it's sitting between in China. It is recognized, it is understood, but it is nascent in being able to structure it so that commercial actors, let me be clear, commercial actors can quickly understand the scenario and understand the situation. Unlike the US, where from a business perspective and commercial perspective, based on the density of what is happening in space in low Earth orbit, there is a healthy dialogue ongoing that then generates the interest, even if formally, somewhat informally, or in a more decentralized fashion, to try to understand what the problem is. And what we found, both sides were enlightened by how the other did it, which I found incredible in that respect. But in the last thing I'll add is the Chinese speakers understood that there is a second and third order effect if this is not addressed. The US understands it as well. It's just they're in different, at this point, they're just in different levels of seeing the problem and the consequences, but that does not negate that either side didn't understand it. It's very clear they both understand it commercially. The secondary aspect of this is if you have some of the leading spacefaring nations understanding this issue, then how do you get this global commons sovereign interest of space? Because space traffic management ultimately is with sovereign interest, whether it's economic interest, diplomatic interest, security interest, or technology interest. You want to build something and so forth. So when you have those four things and you have this disparity in understanding the problem, how do you bring everybody forward? And the Chinese audience brought that to the attention of the US speakers. And again, that dialogue to the third step, which is what is the structure to be able to integrate and have an education part. So how do we do that? And what we learned from both sides speaking, and we had a subject matter experts on space traffic management that provided commercial service, is at the end, there's a market there. And what I mean by that is, unlike if we were talking aircraft control, there is a market to integrate safety, to integrate the standards from a commercial perspective to get validation across the world. And even if you're in a small country, there is an air traffic tower and there are some training requirements and there's some standards there. So I'll stop there for now, Ian, to give you an opportunity to feedback on that, and then we'll talk perceptions, which is, I think, the other big topic we should talk about before we turn to it.
Yeah, we definitely do need to spend a little bit of time on that topic because it's a key underlying thread throughout all of this work. So, thank you, Jose. I mean, I think that was a pretty good introduction and summary of what we talked about yesterday. So, just for the audience's benefit, in the conversation yesterday, we had as subject matter experts, we had a U.S. Commercial satellite operator, a U.S. commercial space situational awareness and space traffic management data provider, and a former high-level U.S. Department of Commerce official looking at the space domain. On the Chinese side, we had two Chinese space companies, commercial space companies, which both build and manufacture small satellites for communications purposes. So we had practitioners across the domain, no pun intended, there. So I think, to add to what Jose said, a key theme that I was thinking about coming out of the discussion when we were sharing perspectives was that to build enhanced understanding of space traffic management and space safety, there are multiple levels, and both our American and Chinese colleagues recognize these multiple levels. And so it starts with education and access to the basic principles fundamental understanding and industry practices, academic research. As new operators come into the space domain through space commercialization, they have an interest in space safety, but they may not know and they may not have already access to the existing body of practice. So how do we communicate and share that information? That's a challenge in both countries and a challenge across the community. Discussion of the multiple layers, technical and technical and economic that goes into building a space business and operating safely. So things like debris removal, on-orbit servicing, data collection, all of these things are layers to space traffic management and space safety. Our operators talked about the need to have clear and timely access to data and how they know where that critical space safety data is and how operators can share that between themselves. That's a clear theme of discussion that we had. We had recognition that the government and industry will move at different paces on implementing space traffic management, space traffic coordination, and that's not necessarily a problem. It's just a nature of how the industry is structured. And then we discussed the role of standards, that there would be an important interim role for standards in ensuring space safety that will then eventually need to be reflected in some regulatory action and then updated as technology and business changes. So that's what I was thinking about after the discussion yesterday. It was, So
I want to jump in on that because go ahead.
Please, Jose.
No, I want to jump in on that because the undercurrent that you stated was very clear about perceptions. As we prepared for this event, there were perceptions on both sides, and that's very common when you're doing track 2 diplomatic discussions. But one of in the discussion in a single perception that stood out, and I want to share with everybody, was the discussion of a space race. The use of that word in terms of promoting sovereign interests or promoting commercial interests, regardless of how you do it, leads to a perception that someone has to set the rules and tell the other what to do. That, either side, it does not matter what side you're in, it sets an apprehension for the discussion. So while in a sovereign's interest, you might want to say, hey, we want a space race. Just know, as I'm a soldier, I can tell you our interests are first, and so on and so forth. There is an escalating effect on the commercial side because now you have not contested, but you have imbalanced in unserene scenario for how to execute business in space. And as we're building these nascent commercial platforms through these nations, do we want them truly to be unstable when the language is leading to a perception that then leads to apprehension to have the dialogue on space traffic management? So you can create a million rules, but if you can't get the perception to say, hey, here's what this is about. It is truly about safety. It is truly about understanding. It's about building stability so that everyone can operate, or as many players can operate safely. We saw that was the number one dialogue on both ends, on both sides, and we concluded that discussion. How do we? The discussion then led into how do you get to a place of commonality? And the only place that they saw that there was a good discussion was geostationary orbit. And while geostationary orbit is not low Earth orbit, it's not necessarily space traffic management as we have defined it. There are several principles. There are some policies and there's some management, primarily through radio frequency, that could serve as an underbelly I don't want to use the word underbelly, but as a stage for how to dismiss some of these perceptions. And Ian, I'll turn to you on this one because I was a secretary on this and you were overseeing anything else you saw.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. And I think there are a couple of questions so I'll be brief in this answer so that we can get to those. Yeah, I mean perception. So I'm gonna actually take this and broaden it back out to what we've learned from the dialogue in general, right? Where because in unmatched perceptions and misperceptions, and those are slightly different things, but those have played a powerful role in shaping this discourse all along, right? That there are the ways the U.S. community perceives what China is doing, and there's ways that the community in China perceives what the U.S. is doing. And so, throughout this dialogue, I think one of the ironies or interesting things that we found is that stakeholders in both countries, kind of argue very similar lines of argument that the other country has major advantages in certain areas of space activities, and you can see language mirrored in both countries where the space race type of rhetoric is prevalent in discussion. And so, in a situation where both sides may believe that the other is better funded, has better government support, and has less bureaucratic hurdles, contributes to that ongoing context of a space race discussion, and whether that is probably not the most effective way to characterize the competition that we do see. So again, it's just our interest here, and what we're trying to do is try to provide a little bit of nuance, provide a little bit better understanding in that discussion. And so I'll leave that there. That's not really an answer to the question that you asked me, Jose, but that's
no, I understand. So, it's fine.
Yeah,
perfectly fine.
Yep. Yep. So Blaine, I don't know if you want to switch over to the
let's go to questions.
Yep. So we do have a couple of questions, and I will keep the askers anonymous just for their own, but I will say that the first question comes from a commercial orbital debris removal company, and the asker asks, do you really believe market-based forces suffice for space traffic management and space safety, and governments can just leave it to industry? Or I guess implicitly the other option would be, do you think there needs to be more, let's say, explicit government regulation around STM and space safety? So if either of you would like to take a first go.
You want me to field that first, and then you back me up, Ian, on this one? Because that was the policy versus principles discussion. So you good with that? Okay. So I'll share on this, and the challenge, the number one challenge is the policies as it pertains to the question goes into the policies. In the discussion, so we're talking about the speakers. In that discussion, the speakers addressed that the principles have come first, especially in the United States, to be able to address how you get the market forces to move. Now, the policy development is not operating at the speed of economics, of diplomatic, of security, of technology development. So what ends up happening is there has to be a balance as you are executing this dance. And what the speaker, and again, Ian, check me on this, but the speakers agree that there is an informal, principles-based approach that then the market forces can help maintain and sustain the behaviors in space until such a time as policy that's dealing with sovereign interests can catch up. But how do you get to that? Well, you have to get through that through dialogue. And that's kind of, they themselves came full circle in that discussion. Ian, I'll turn it to you on that.
And Ian, you might be on mute. I believe I don't know, or your audio is not.
There we go. Now I got it. Yep, I got it. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yep. Thank you, Blaine. Sorry, there's a mute button on my microphone that occasionally gets bumped up against the anyway. As I was saying, I think the answer to this question is yes, no, and both. Right? It's when we talk about space traffic management, we often have this discussion of whether it should be bottom up or top down. The reality is that it's going to occur at multiple levels. There's going to be industry best practice commitment standards, and there's going to be regulatory action, and the balance of that is where the tough policy question and tough economic question lies, is where does that balance fall out. And so from the perspective of the senior U.S. Space Commercialization Dialogue, including yesterday's session, but also the other sessions that we've had, we have often talked about what is the appropriate level of regulation for space, for commercial space activities, and where does regulatory best practice exist, and how can that regulatory best practice be applied in jurisdictions that have different economic and policy systems? So we mentioned the October workshop that we had that focused on commercial human spaceflight. We had an extensive discussion during that workshop of when and how and what type of commercial or safety regulations do you put into place onto commercial human spaceflight companies, and how do you balance wanting to let innovation occur and wanting certain levels of risk taking to occur while making sure that you're dealing with human life here, and you need to have a certain level of safety protection. So we talked about the U.S. experience. Not to get too deep into this, but the U.S. has a regulatory learning process going on around commercial human spaceflight right now, and so we talked about the experience there and whether that that allows industry experience to be taken into account and then codified through regulatory action. So I think this is a long-winded answer, but I think the way forward is that there's going to be a balancing of industry commitment and regulatory practice that is in the solution set for space traffic management.
And I would just jump on that and say that the 4 areas that allow that the levers that essentially balance this thing from the discussion yesterday is economics, it is security, diplomacy, and then technology development. So if there's any officials that are working on that, I think that's where the balance is. If the perception impacts one of those 4, it's going to delay the ability to go from practice, working together with policy to have that stability in space. And that's what was coming out of the discussion yesterday. Let's do the next question, if possible.
Definitely. Well, just one last point to close on this question, and then, yes, we have another very good question here. But yeah, I think definitely it speaks to this idea that the perception of a space race, the perception of, say, a land grab phase in the space domain, it certainly contributes to, I guess, the need to have government regulation, but also, I think, more directly, the need to have coordination between the two sides. Because, again, there's this perception of a space race. If everyone thinks that everyone's trying to go up there and grab as much land or space, as it were, as possible in the shortest amount of time possible, that's going to lead to, I think, a lot of hasty decisions potentially in terms of deploying things that maybe are not so well coordinated. So yeah, really interesting question. So many thanks to the Commercial Orbital Debris Removal Company representative that asked that question. So the second question, and just a reminder, we have about 8 minutes, so if you have another question, do feel free. How does your dialogue distinguish between quote-unquote capacity building for best operating practices and the more politically fraught issue of technology transfer?
Oof. That's an easy one.
That's a session in and of itself, right?
That's a session.
So, I'm gonna put you on the spot, and then I'll come in. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So the track to diplomatic discussion, and just to kind of be clear, we don't discuss things like the financing aspects of it. We do not discuss technology aspects of it. There are, at times throughout the years, have been some presentations that explain what the effect of the technology, but it does not go into technology transfer. So, and again, to recap, a track to diplomatic discussion is an opportunity for dialogues from different members of industry or from different members of nonprofit organizations to be able to discuss about topics that may be otherwise sensitive from a foreign sovereign perspective. So when you start dealing with things like tech transfer or things like how does something finance, that from at least a U.S. regulatory, and I know for a Chinese regulatory perspective, is not a discussion point. So it doesn't come up. Now, does the dialogues influence the thinking on how an official can think about tech transfer? I can tell you, and Ian and I can vehemently tell you that yes, it absolutely does. And that's the beauty of these discussions, because when we're not talking about it, you start seeing the perceptions and you start seeing how the misunderstandings can occur, or better yet, you clarify a point that in fact there is an issue there. So it isn't always clarifying that there isn't an issue, and sometimes you can clarify that there is an issue, and it stands right in front of you, and you can't miss it. And we've caught that maybe once or twice in the entire 3-year period, where it was evident that there was an issue we didn't talk about it, but there was an issue that dealt with that transfer loosely, and those officials will figure it out, and that's what they do. Ian, anything you want to add to this?
So just a couple of kind of process side. I mean, so we do have, I'm not going to belabor it, go into it, but we do have you go through a legal review process with the U.S. speakers. Did it happen again? Can you hear me?
No, you're good. You're good. Keep going.
Yeah. So we do go through a legal process, a review process with our U.S. speakers, and I'm sure there is a similar discussion that happens in the coordination with our Chinese colleagues in their preparation process. We also do. We are careful to regularly brief U.S. government officials, and on the other side, I'm sure that same process is going on, just to, again, the U.S. government, Chinese government, they participate as observers to this process. They don't directly speak, but we do keep them informed of what is going on, just so that we ensure that there's awareness there. And then in terms of the substance of the actual discussions, I think Jose did a good job of discussing that. But these events, these dialogues, these are what the benefit is, and what we try to do is about building relationships and understanding of approaches in terms of culture and thought and structure, and not about specific programs or projects. So it's really about building that interpersonal understanding, more so than it is about the specific details of any one activity.
I agree.
So that kind of helps in setting the expectations of what the discussion is about.
Definitely. And I think the interpersonal understanding and sort of how that gets, how that increases over the years, it makes the dialogues, progressively smoother and maybe a little bit easier in that way. So we have one more question. We have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to have to ask you to keep the answers to about a minute or less. Are there any equivalent initiatives or negotiations going on with other countries?
So I'll take that one. I'm aware of some Track 2 discussions going on more on the space security side of the equation with U.S. and Russian space stakeholders. That's primarily at an academic sort of level, not at an industry level. That's the main other example that I'm aware of in the space domain. Outside of space, there are a number of organizations that run Track 2 discussions on U.S.-China relations. The National Committee on U.S.-China Relations is a big example, and they cover a range of economic domains outside of space, looking at U.S.-China, and then in other bilaterals, there are similar organizations as well. So that's a brief, incomplete answer, but that's what I've got. So hope that helps.
Definitely. Jose, anything to add from your side? Are we all good?
No, I just want to thank everyone for doing this. Relationships are a factor. There will always be sovereign interest, but our job and our mission here is to provide options and be objective, provide options so that leaders can make our world safer. And that's what this is about, being peaceful, approaching outer space. So it's been our honor to support the U.S. and obviously for our partners at the CSA to do the same thing for China. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And Ian, any closing remarks from your side? I also see that we have a bunch more questions that seem to have not come through, and otherwise were in languages other than English. So we may have some homework after this to get back to some people. Yes. But that's good to know there's interest. Ian, closing remarks. We got about 45 seconds.
30 seconds. Yeah. So yeah, I'm happy to answer questions offline. I do appreciate that. That's always the best part. So I just want to thank Jose, thank Blaine, thank the participants that have participated in these discussions, and thank our colleagues at the CSA. I mean, this is an ongoing process. We've learned a lot. We have a lot more to learn, and please do reach out to Jose or myself. Both of our contact informations are easily found on the internet, and we would be happy to talk to you more about what we're doing, and if you're interested in participating. So thank you all, and thank you for coming to the session today.
Very cool. And with that, I do encourage you to connect with me offline as well. You can find me on LinkedIn at the hashtag China Space Guy. That is a pretty easy one to remember. So hashtag China Space Guy, I guarantee you will find me. So that brings us to the end of this how to construct a U.S.-China space commercialization dialogue forum. And again, big thanks to the Paris Peace Forum for hosting us. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with anyone who is interested and updating you in the future as to how these track 2 diplomatic discussions between the US and China go. And so thank you very much for your kind attention, and thank you very much to my 2 excellent panelists, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.